The winter of 1944 was a frozen nightmare for the Allies, but for the German Panzerwaffe, it was supposed to be their final hour of glory. As the fog rolled across the Ardennes, German tank commanders sat confidently inside their Tigers and Panthers. They had spent years terrorizing the battlefield, knowing that the American Shermans were little more than targets. To the Germans, American armor was a joke. They called them Ronsons because they lit up the first time they were hit. But on a cold February morning near the town of Elsdorf, that arrogance was about to be shattered. A German scout peered through his binoculars and saw a silhouette that didn't fit the profile of any Allied vehicle. It was low, wide, and carried a gun so long it looked like a sniper rifle for a giant. The air in the German turret went cold. This was the debut of the M26 Pershing. The German crew didn't know it yet, but they were looking at the end of their supremacy. For months, Nazi propaganda had assured every soldier that the Americans were incapable of building a heavy tank. They were told the decadent West only cared about mass production, not quality. But as this new beast ground its way through the slush, the German commander realized his Tiger was no longer the apex predator. This wasn't a Tommy Cooker. This was a precision-engineered killing machine designed for one specific purpose: to hunt and destroy the pride of the Third Reich. The Pershing's engine didn't scream. It growled with a deep, rhythmic power that shook the very ground. As the American tank leveled its massive 90-millimeter barrel, the Germans realized that the easy war against thin-skinned Shermans was over. The hunter had officially become the prey. The first shot fired by a Pershing in combat didn't just hit a tank, it hit the morale of the entire Wehrmacht. A Tiger I, the most feared symbol of Nazi power, emerged from the ruins of a village, expecting to see a fleeing Sherman. Instead, it faced Eagle 7, a Pershing commanded by Sergeant Maschlinek. The German gunner, a veteran of the Eastern Front, reacted with lightning speed and fired an 88-millimeter shell. In any other scenario, that would have been the end of the story. But the shell struck the Pershing's frontal armor and glanced off, screaming into the sky. The German crew was paralyzed. Their invincible gun had failed. Before they could reload, the Pershing roared. The 90-millimeter armor-piercing round traveled at such a high velocity that the German crew didn't even see the muzzle flash before their world turned into a furnace. The impact was catastrophic. The 90-millimeter shell punched through the Tiger's frontal plate like a hot needle through wax. It didn't just penetrate, it shattered the internal structure of the tank, detonating the ammunition stored in the hull. The Tiger's turret was lifted off its ring by the sheer force of the explosion. When the smoke cleared, the invincible Tiger was a blackened, hollowed-out steel skull. American infantry watching from the foxholes let out a cheer that could be heard over the artillery. They had spent years running from these monsters, and now they finally had a champion. For the German survivors who managed to crawl out of the wreckage, the sight of the Pershing was incomprehensible. They stood in the mud, staring at the American tank with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. By that evening, the first German prisoners were being brought to a makeshift interrogation center. Among them was a decorated panzer captain, a man who had burned his way through Russia and France. He sat in a wooden chair, his uniform scorched, refusing to speak. That was, until the American intelligence officer placed a photo of the M26 Pershing on the table. The captain's eyes locked onto the image. He didn't see a machine, he saw a ghost. He began to stammer in German, demanding to know where the Americans had stolen the design. He was convinced it was a Russian heavy tank or a British secret weapon. He couldn't or wouldn't accept that American factories had produced something that surpassed German engineering. His voice trembled as he asked, "How many of these monsters do you have?" The American officer leaned back and smiled, though he knew the truth. There were only 20 Pershings in Europe at that moment. But he didn't tell the German that. Instead, he told him that thousands more were on the way. The German captain fell into a deep, heavy silence. He looked at his hands, realizing that every tactical manual he had ever studied was now obsolete. The psychological shield of the German soldier, the belief that they were technologically superior, had been cracked. The interrogator's notes from that night described the captain as completely broken. It wasn't the loss of the battle that destroyed him. It was the realization that the Americans had beaten them at their own game. The myth of the master race of engineers died in that interrogation room, replaced by the cold reality of American steel. To understand the shock of the German POWs, you have to understand Mission Zebra. For years, the U.S. Army was locked in a bitter internal debate. Generals like Patton believed the Sherman was enough because it was fast and easy to repair. They were wrong. After the massacre at the Battle of the Bulge, the Pentagon realized they needed a Tiger killer. In January 1945, 20 T-26E3 tanks, the prototype version of the Pershing, were loaded onto ships under the highest level of secrecy. This wasn't just a shipment, it was an experiment. The tanks were sent to Antwerp with a team of technicians and instructors. Their mission was to find the toughest sectors of the front and prove that American armor could dominate. No press, no fanfares. The Americans wanted the Germans to find out about the Pershing the hard way. When the crates were opened in Belgium, the American crews who saw the tanks for the first time were just as shocked as the Germans would later be. They had never seen an American tank with torsion bar suspension or a 90mm gun. They spent 48 hours in a crash course learning how to drive and fire the machines while the sounds of the front lines echoed in the distance. These 20 tanks were the spearhead of a new era. They were divided between the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions, units that had been decimated by German heavies and were hungry for a weapon that could hit back. As the Pershings moved toward the Rhine, they were covered in tarps to hide their silhouette. The Zebra tanks were a secret weapon that the Allies hoped would be the final nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. The most famous moment of the Pershing's career happened in the shadows of the Cologne Cathedral. A German Panther tank, the fastest and lethal medium tank of the war, was waiting at a street corner. It had already destroyed one Sherman, and its crew felt confident. They knew that no Allied tank could face them head-on and survive. But Sergeant Early's Pershing was moving through the rubble of a parallel street. As the Pershing turned the corner, the Panther's turret began to rotate. It was a classic Western standoff. The German gunner had his sights on the Pershing, but he hesitated for a split second. He had never seen this type of tank before, and he wasn't sure where to aim. That half-second of confusion was the difference between life and death. Inside the Pershing, gunner Clarence Smoyer didn't hesitate. He didn't even wait for the tank to stop. He fired on the move. The 90mm shell slammed into the Panther's side, erupting in a fountain of sparks and fire. Smoyer fired again, and a third time, ensuring the steel beast would never move again. This entire engagement was captured on film by a combat cameraman, and it became a sensation. But for the German soldiers watching from the ruins, it was a horror movie. Their best tank, manned by an elite crew, had been dismantled in seconds by a machine they didn't even recognize. When the Panther crew members scrambled out, their clothes on fire, they looked at the Pershing with the same haunting expression every POW would eventually share. The look of a man who realized he had been fighting a war that was already lost. While the standard M26 was a nightmare for the Germans, the Americans had one more secret hidden up their sleeve, a variant so powerful it was almost unfair. This was the Super Pershing. There was only one in the entire theater of war, and it was a Frankenstein's monster of battlefield engineering. It was fitted with an experimental, extra-long 90mm T-15E1 gun that could punch through a Panther's front plate from miles away. But the Americans didn't stop there. Fearing the German 88mm guns, mechanics took massive slabs of 38mm boilerplate and even salvaged armor from destroyed German tanks, welding it onto the front of the Super Pershing. It looked like a jagged, terrifying wall of scrap metal and death. When German scouts first spotted this thing through their periscopes, they didn't even report it as a tank. They reported it as a moving fortress that defied the laws of physics. The Super Pershing was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Its barrel was so heavy it needed massive external springs just to keep it level. It was the Americans' answer to the King Tiger, and it was looking for blood.
In one legendary encounter near the town of Dessau, the Super Pershing came face to face with what many believe was a king tiger or a powerful jag panther. The German crew fired first, their heart in their throats. The shell struck the Super Pershing's added armor, but instead of piercing, it simply ricocheted off the junk armor slabs. The American crew didn't even flinch. They leveled that monstrous long barrel and fired a single shot. The high-velocity round didn't just penetrate the German tank. It passed through the front, the engine, and out the back. The explosion was so violent it left the German POWs in the area trembling in their boots.
The shock wasn't limited to the soldiers in the mud. It reached the highest levels of German engineering. In April 1945, a group of German tank designers and inspectors were captured near a rail hub. When they were shown a captured but mostly intact Pershing, their reaction was one of scientific grief. They spent hours crawling over the vehicle, measuring the thickness of the cast steel and examining the torsion bar suspension. These were the men who had designed the Tiger, and yet they were baffled by the M26's efficiency. They noted with horror that the American tank was significantly lighter than their heavy tanks. What truly broke the German specialists was the human factor built into the machine. In German tanks, ergonomics were an afterthought. The crews were often cramped, surrounded by sharp edges and complex, fragile levers. But inside the Pershing, they found a spacious layout, cushioned seats, and a vision system that gave the commander a 360-degree view of the slaughter. The German engineers realized that while they were building exotic weapons, the Americans had built a weapon for the soldier. This realization was a crushing blow to their national pride. They saw that the American industry hadn't just caught up, it had leaped a decade ahead. The German experts argued among themselves, some claiming the steel was a special alien alloy. They couldn't believe that the decadent American factory workers in Detroit had outthought the elite designers of the Third Reich. When the Allies made their daring dash across the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the Pershings were the iron fist that secured the bridgehead. The Germans knew that if they didn't destroy the bridge, the heart of Germany was open. They sent everything, frogmen, V-2 rockets, and their final reserve of heavy armor. A group of German Tiger commanders were ordered to counterattack and push the Yanks back into the Rhine. They moved through the darkness, expecting to encounter the usual thin-skinned American vehicles. Instead, they ran into a wall of M26s. In the pitch-black night, the muzzle flashes of the 90mm guns looked like lightning strikes. The German tanks were being picked off before they could even identify their targets. The German survivors who surrendered at dawn described the experience as trying to fight a ghost with a sledgehammer. One captured German lieutenant from the 11th Panzer Division was found wandering near the bridge in a state of total shock. He kept repeating the same phrase to his captors, "The iron doesn't stop. Your iron doesn't stop." He had seen his entire company of Panthers wiped out in less than 20 minutes by a handful of Pershings. He told the interrogators that his men had fired directly at the new American tanks, but the shells simply didn't do their job. For a soldier who had been raised on the myth of German steel's invincibility, this was a mental collapse. He watched as the Pershings continued to roll across the bridge, their wide tracks clanking rhythmically over the metal girders. To him, each tank was a nail in the coffin of his country. The sight of the Pershing at Remagen was the final proof that the German Wunderwaffen were too little, too late. Behind every Pershing on the front line was a logistics chain that the Germans couldn't even fathom in their wildest dreams. While the German army was retreating using horse-drawn wagons because they lacked fuel and spare parts, the Americans were moving 40-ton tanks across the ocean like they were crates of oranges. German POWs who were moved to the rear were staggered by what they saw. They saw miles of roads choked with American trucks, tankers, and recovery vehicles. But most of all, they saw the M26s being serviced with brand new parts. In the German army, if a Tiger broke a transmission, it was often abandoned and blown up by its own crew. In the American army, a Pershing could have its entire engine power pack swapped out in the middle of a muddy field in a matter of hours. This industrial disparity was the ultimate psychological black hole for the captured Germans. They realized they weren't just fighting a better tank, they were fighting a better civilization. One German captain noted that while his men were starving and shivering, the American tank crews were eating hot meals and had access to endless supplies of 90mm ammunition. He watched an American maintenance crew replace a damaged track on a Pershing with such speed and efficiency that he thought it was a rehearsed theater performance. It wasn't. It was simply the American way of war. For the German POWs, the new American tank was the symbol of an industrial avalanche that was currently burying the Third Reich. They realized that even if they destroyed one Pershing, 10 more would take its place by sunset. What truly broke the German specialists was the human factor built into the machine. In German tanks, ergonomics were an afterthought. The crews were often cramped, surrounded by sharp edges and complex, fragile levers. But inside the Pershing, they found a spacious layout, cushioned seats, and a vision system that gave the commander a 360-degree view of the slaughter. The German engineers realized that while they were building exotic weapons, the Americans had built a weapon for the soldier. This realization was a crushing blow to their national pride. They saw that the American industry hadn't just caught up, it had leaped a decade ahead. The German experts argued among themselves, some claiming the steel was a special alien alloy. They couldn't believe that the decadent American factory workers in Detroit had outthought the elite designers of the Third Reich. When the Allies made their daring dash across the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the Pershings were the iron fist that secured the bridgehead. The Germans knew that if they didn't destroy the bridge, the heart of Germany was open. They sent everything: frogmen, V-2 rockets, and their final reserve of heavy armor. A group of German Tiger commanders were ordered to counterattack and push the Yanks back into the Rhine. They moved through the darkness, expecting to encounter the usual thin-skinned American vehicles. Instead, they ran into a wall of M26s. In the pitch-black night, the muzzle flashes of the 90mm guns looked like lightning strikes. The German tanks were being picked off before they could even identify their targets. The German survivors who surrendered at dawn described the experience as trying to fight a ghost with a sledgehammer. One captured German lieutenant from the 11th Panzer Division was found wandering near the bridge in a state of total shock. He kept repeating the same phrase to his captors: "The iron doesn't stop. Your iron doesn't stop." He had seen his entire company of Panthers wiped out in less than 20 minutes by a handful of Pershings. He told the interrogators that his men had fired directly at the new American tanks, but the shells simply didn't do their job. For a soldier who had been raised on the myth of German steel's invincibility, this was a mental collapse. He watched as the Pershings continued to roll across the bridge, their wide tracks clanking rhythmically over the metal girders. To him, each tank was a nail in the coffin of his country. The sight of the Pershing at Remagen was the final proof that the German Wunderwaffen were too little, too late. Behind every Pershing on the front line was a logistics chain that the Germans couldn't even fathom in their wildest dreams. While the German army was retreating using horse-drawn wagons because they lacked fuel and spare parts, the Americans were moving 40-ton tanks across the ocean like they were crates of oranges. German POWs who removed to the rear were staggered by what they saw. They saw miles of roads choked with American trucks, tankers, and recovery vehicles. But most of all, they saw the M26s being serviced with brand new parts. In the German army, if a Tiger broke a transmission, it was often abandoned and blown up by its own crew. In the American army, a Pershing could have its entire engine power pack swapped out in the middle of a muddy field in a matter of hours. This industrial disparity was the ultimate psychological black hole for the captured Germans. They realized they weren't just fighting a better tank, they were fighting a better civilization. One German captain noted that while his men were starving and shivering, the American tank crews were eating hot meals and had access to endless supplies of 90mm ammunition. He watched an American maintenance crew replace a damaged track on a Pershing with such speed and efficiency that he thought it was a rehearsed theater performance. It wasn't. It was simply the American way of war. For the German POWs, the new American tank was the symbol of an industrial avalanche that was currently burying the Third Reich. They realized that even if they destroyed one Pershing, 10 more would take its place by sunset.
As the war reached its final weeks, the Tiger terror that had gripped the Allied armies for years had completely reversed. Now it was Pershing panic that spread through the German ranks. In the town of Iserlohn, a German commander of a heavy tank destroyer unit was told that a group of Pershings was approaching his position. He didn't even order his men to load their guns. He simply walked out into the street with a white flag. When asked why he surrendered so easily, he replied, "I saw what those guns did to the tanks in the next village. I am a soldier, not a suicide victim." This was the ultimate victory of the M26. It didn't even have to fire a shot to take the city. Its reputation had outpaced its tracks. The German prisoners were often seen crowding around the Pershings in the surrender camps, touching the armor as if to convince themselves it was real. They looked at the long, elegant barrels of the 90mm guns and the massive cast steel turrets. For these men, the Pershing was the physical manifestation of their defeat. It was the machine that had finally silenced the big cats. The myth of German armored superiority, which had been the backbone of the Wehrmacht's RAL since 1939, was officially dead. It was buried under the weight of the M26 Pershing. As the war ended, the Pershing stood tall in the ruins of Berlin and Munich, a silent guardian of a new world order. The German POWs, looking back from their barbed wire enclosures, knew that the world would never be the same again. German engineers had always prided themselves on their complex suspension systems, specifically the overlapping road wheels of the Tiger. They thought it was the height of sophistication, but when German POWs were forced to help American mechanics maintain a Pershing, they saw something that made their jaws drop: torsion bar suspension. Instead of a fragile, overlapping mess that jammed with frozen mud and rocks, the Pershing had a clean, efficient row of independent bars. One captured German mechanic, who had spent the entire winter chipping ice out of Tiger tracks, reportedly wept when he saw how easily the American tank could be serviced. He realized that while Germany had built clockworks, the Americans had built war machines. The simplicity of the design allowed the Pershing to maintain high speeds over terrain that would have snapped the axles of a Panther. The German prisoners watched in silence as American crews replaced a torsion bar in a fraction of the time it took to fix a German heavy. This wasn't just a technical detail, it was a fundamental shift in the philosophy of war. To the Germans, a tank was a masterpiece of individual craftsmanship. To the Americans, a tank was a tool that needed to stay in the fight. The German POWs began to understand that their defeat wasn't just due to numbers, but to a superior understanding of how to keep armor moving. They saw Pershings that had been hit, repaired, and sent back to the front within 24 hours. In the German army, a similar hit would have meant a trip back to a factory in Essen, if the factory still existed. This mechanical reliability was a silent killer that the German high command never saw coming. One of the most terrifying aspects of the Pershing for the German soldiers was its optics. German tanks had long held the crown for the best glass in the world with their Zeiss periscopes. However, the M26 arrived with a new generation of American fire control and stabilized sights. At the Battle of Elsdorf, a Persian commander spotted a German anti-tank nest from over 2,000 yards away, a distance where the Germans felt completely invisible. With a single calculated shot, the Pershing's 90mm gun vaporized the position before the Germans even knew they were being watched. When the survivors of that unit were captured, they were convinced the Americans were using guided rockets or some form of radar aiming. They simply couldn't believe an American tank could be that accurate at such an extreme range. The psychological impact of being sniped by a 40-ton tank cannot be overstated. German infantry who used to feel safe behind stone walls or in reinforced basements found that the 90mm high explosive rounds could punch through multiple layers of brick and still detonate with lethal force. One captured German officer noted that the new tank didn't just fire, it erased targets. He described the sound of the 90mm shell as a rip in the sky, followed by total annihilation. In the interrogation reports, this became a recurring theme. The Germans felt that the rules of engagement had been changed without their consent. They were used to a war of maneuvers and close quarters brawling, but the Pershing was turning the battlefield into a one-sided execution from the horizon.
Not every encounter was an easy victory, but even the Pershing's failures shocked the Germans. In one famous incident, a Pershing named Fireball was ambushed by a Tiger I at close range. The Tiger fired 3 shots, hitting the Pershing's turret and gun. By all accounts, the American tank should have been a pile of scrap, but the Pershing's heavy casting absorbed the impact in a way the Germans hadn't seen before. Although the tank was disabled, the crew survived. When the Germans later saw photos of the damaged but still intact Pershing, they were stunned. They were used to seeing Shermans explode like gasoline-soaked torches. Seeing an American tank take multiple hits from a Tiger and remain repairable was a devastating blow to the myth of the 88mm gun's supremacy. When the Germans eventually retreated from that sector, they left behind reports expressing confusion. They couldn't understand why their killer shots hadn't turned the Pershing into a coffin for its crew. This durability became a legend among the German POWs. They began to tell stories of the undead tank that could survive the fires of hell. This made the German anti-tank crews hesitate. If their best gun couldn't guarantee a kill, what was the point of firing and giving away their position? This hesitation saved countless American lives. The Pershing's ability to take a punch and keep its crew alive was the ultimate proof of American engineering's shift toward quality. The German prisoners realized that they were no longer the only ones with heavy iron on the field. As the Pershings rolled through the burning streets of German cities, the local populations looked on in a mixture of awe and terror. For the captured soldiers of the Volkssturm, the last-ditch militia of old men and boys, the M26 looked like something from a science fiction novel. They had been told the Americans were weak and unrefined, but the Pershing was a masterpiece of lethal elegance. Its engine didn't smoke or rattle like the overworked Maybach engines in the Panthers. It had a smooth, terrifying hum. This was the ghost of Detroit, the physical proof that the United States had mastered the art of total war. The German POWs were often seen pointing at the tank's wide tracks, which allowed it to climb over rubble and ruins that would have bogged down any other vehicle. By the time the Pershing reached the Elbe River, the German army was in a state of total disintegration. Entire divisions were surrendering just to avoid having to face the new heavies in one last futile battle. One German general, after signing the surrender papers, asked his American counterpart for one favor. He wanted to touch the barrel of a Pershing. And when he did, he reportedly said, "This is why we lost. We built the past, but you built the future." This sentiment echoed through every POW camp in Europe. The Pershing wasn't just a tank, it was a message. It told the world that the era of German armored dominance was over, and a new superpower had claimed the throne. The silent, shocked faces of the German prisoners were the final testament to the Pershing's true power. As the M26 Pershing began to tear through the German lines, reports finally reached the Führer bunker in Berlin. Intelligence officers presented Hitler with sketches and technical data of the new American heavy. For years, Hitler had been obsessed with superweapons, believing that only Germany could produce a heavy tank of quality. When he heard that the Americans had successfully deployed a 90mm armed beast that could rival his Tigers, he reportedly flew into a rage. He accused his generals of incompetence and his spies of treason for not warning him sooner. The German high command scrambled to find a countermeasure, but there was nothing left. Their factories were being bombed into dust, and their fuel reserves were gone. The Pershing wasn't just a tank to them anymore. It was the physical proof that their Wunderwaffen strategy had failed. The captured German staff officers who had seen these reports later confessed that the arrival of the Pershing caused a wave of technological despair at the top levels of the Wehrmacht. They realized that their only advantage, armored superiority, had been snatched away. Orders were sent out to prioritize the destruction of any M26 at all costs, offering iron crosses to any infantryman who could disable one. But the German soldiers on the ground were exhausted and demoralized. When they saw the Pershing approaching, they didn't see a target.
They saw a symbol of an industrial giant they could no longer fight. The reports sent to Hitler became increasingly grim, detailing how the American Tiger was shrugging off hits and obliterating German defenses from distances that were previously considered safe zones. In the final weeks of the war, the German countryside became a graveyard for the once mighty Panzerwaffe. Roads were lined with the burnt-out husks of Panthers and Mark IVs, many of them destroyed by Pershings from distances the Germans couldn't even see. In one engagement near the Weser River, a single Pershing held a crossroads against a retreating armored column. The German tankers, desperate to escape the closing Allied pincer, tried to rush the position, but the Pershing sat like a stone sentinel, its 90mm gun barking with rhythmic precision. Every time a German tank poked its nose out from the tree line, it was met with a high-velocity shell that turned the interior of the tank into a molten furnace. The Germans were trapped in a steel trap of their own making. When the smoke cleared and the surviving Germans surrendered, they were marched past the ruins of their own vehicles. They looked at the clean entry holes made by the 90mm rounds, small, precise punctures that led to total internal devastation. One German veteran, a man who had fought from the gates of Moscow to the fields of France, sat by the side of the road and wept. He wasn't crying for the Nazi cause, but for the loss of his comrades in a fight that had become hopelessly one-sided. He looked at the Pershing parked nearby, its crew calmly smoking cigarettes on the turret. To him, the American tank looked like an intruder from another century, a sleek, modern machine that had come to bury the archaic, boxy remnants of the Third Reich's military dreams. As the war ended, millions of German soldiers were processed into POW camps. The conversation among the tankers always returned to the new American monster. In these camps, the myths began to crystallize. Some claimed the Pershing had invisible armor, while others insisted the Americans had found a way to make their shells track the heat of German engines. While these were just rumors born of fear, the underlying truth was clear. The Germans had been outclassed. A group of captured Tiger commanders were given a chance to inspect a Pershing under American guard. They walked around the tank in a strange, respectful silence, running their hands over the smooth, cast steel turret. This was the moment of the verdict. They realized that the decadent Americans had not just outproduced them, they had outthought them. One German commander who had lost his entire battalion to a combined force of Pershings and Shermans made a final comment to his captors. He said, "We built tanks to win battles. You built a tank to win the war." This distinction was crucial. The Pershing was the culmination of everything the Allies had learned about modern warfare. It was a balance of power, mobility, and reliability. The German prisoners realized that the M26 was the ancestor of a new breed of main battle tanks that would dominate the Cold War for decades to come. As they were loaded into trucks to be sent to labor camps, they took one last look at the Pershings guarding the perimeter. The Tiger terror was officially over. The age of American armored dominance had begun, and the world would never forget the shock of the new American tank. By the time the Allies reached the Ruhr pocket, the Pershing had earned a reputation as a fortress on tracks. German anti-tank units, hidden in the dense urban rubble, found that their standard 75mm Pak-40 guns, the bane of the Sherman, were suddenly losing their sting. At a distance of 500 yards, shots that should have been lethal were bouncing off the Pershing's heavy mantlet. One German gun crew, captured after firing 6 rounds at a single M26, was in a state of nervous collapse. Their commander told the Americans that they had seen the sparks of the hits, but the iron ghost just kept coming, rotating its turret slowly toward them like the eye of an angry god. The sheer psychological weight of knowing that your best weapon is useless is a trauma that few soldiers can survive. It was the moment the German will to resist finally shattered into pieces. This invulnerability was a recurring theme in the diaries of German soldiers found in the final weeks. They wrote about the American Tigers that couldn't be stopped by anything short of a direct hit from a 128mm Jagdtiger. but the Jagdtigers were few and far between, plagued by mechanical failures and a lack of fuel. In contrast, the Pershings were everywhere, supported by an endless supply of gasoline and high-explosive shells. The German POWs realized that they weren't just fighting a machine, but a system that worked with terrifying efficiency. They watched as American recovery vehicles towed away damaged Pershings, only to see the same tanks back in action 2 days later, fresh paint covering the scars of battle. To a German soldier who had seen his own crippled tanks abandoned for a lack of a simple spare part, this was the ultimate proof of their inevitable defeat.
One of the most intense moments of shock for German technical officers came when they inspected the hull of a captured Pershing. They were used to the interlocking plate construction of the Tiger and Panther, which required thousands of man-hours of precision welding. When they saw the Pershing's massive, single-piece cast steel turret and hull sections, they were stunned. This was the alchemy of Detroit, the ability to pour molten steel into complex shapes at a scale the Germans could only dream of. A captured German metallurgist noted that this casting allowed for much better ballistic shaping, eliminating the shot traps and flat surfaces that made German tanks vulnerable to certain angles. He realized that while Germany was stuck in the era of craftsmanship, the Americans had moved into the era of high-tech industrial sculpture. The German specialists were particularly interested in the quality of the steel itself. They had been told that American steel was soft and inferior, but their tests showed a high level of ductility that prevented the armor from cracking under multiple impacts. In German tanks, late war steel often became brittle due to a lack of alloying elements like molybdenum and nickel, causing the armor to spall and spray lethal shards inside the tank, even if the shell didn't penetrate. Seeing that the Americans had no such shortages was a bitter pill to swallow. It meant that the master race was actually the one struggling with resources and quality control. For the German POWs watching these tests, the Pershing wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was a sanctuary. They knew that if they could reach the shadow of the 90mm guns, they would be safe from the vengeance of the East. The sight of the Pershings lined up along the riverbank, their long barrels pointing toward the horizon, was the final image of the war for many. It was a display of power that silenced even the most hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. The Soviet tankers, sitting in their T-34.85s and IS-2s, looked across the river at the Pershings with a newfound respect. They, too, recognized a machine that could rival their own. But for the German prisoners huddled in the mud between the two superpowers, the Pershing was the clear winner. It looked cleaner, more modern, and infinitely more capable than the rugged but crude Soviet machines. One German officer, as he was being processed into an American camp, looked back at a Pershing and remarked to a guard, "I am glad I am on this side of that gun now." This sentiment was the final epitaph of the Panzerwaffe. The war that had begun with the lightning speed of the Blitzkrieg had ended with the heavy, unstoppable rumble of American iron. The Pershing had not just won the battle, it had claimed the future. In the smoldering ruins of Essen, a group of high-ranking German officers were led past a column of M26 Pershings that had just finished clearing a pocket of resistance. One of the Germans, a general who had served as an advisor on the Tiger program, stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't look at the American soldiers, he looked at the underside of the Pershing's turret. He noticed the heavy reinforcement and the lack of a shot trap, a design flaw that had plagued the German Panther for years. He turned to his captor and asked in a voice filled with weary curiosity how long this machine had been in development. When told that the Americans had been refining the design while the Germans were wasting resources on the Mouse and other pipe dreams, the general simply nodded. He realized then that the German obsession with supertanks had blinded them to the reality of balanced engineering. The Mouse and the E-100 were supposed to be Germany's salvation, monsters of such size that they would crush anything in their path. But as the POWs looked at the Pershing, they saw a tank that actually worked. It didn't break its transmission every 50 miles, and it didn't sink into the mud of a standard European field.
The German prisoners began to realize that their leadership had traded military logic for psychological fantasies. The Pershing was the ultimate reality check. It was a heavy tank that could cross bridges, fit on rail cars, and still outgun the best Germany had to offer. For the captured German tankers, this was the most bitter realization of all. They hadn't just been outproduced by an industrial giant, they had been outthought by a nation that prioritized practical lethality over theatrical size. One story that circulated through the POW camps involved a night engagement in the Ruhr Valley. A German Panther crew, using their early model infrared night vision gear, thought they had the advantage. They spotted a silhouette in the distance and prepared to fire. But before they could even range the target, a 90mm shell from a Pershing smashed into their turret. The Americans didn't need infrared. They had used the Panther's own muzzle flash from a previous skirmish to triangulate its position with terrifying accuracy. When the survivors were questioned, they expressed a sense of supernatural dread. They felt as though the Pershing could see through the dark. This was the moment the Germans realized that their technological edge in night fighting was being countered by superior American training and optics. The 90mm gun of the Pershing became a symbol of death from the horizon. To a German soldier, the sound of an 88mm gun was a sharp crack, but the 90mm had a deeper, more resonant boom that seemed to echo through the valleys of Germany like the hammer of a god. Captured infantrymen described the feeling of being hunted by a machine that stayed just out of their reach while picking off their positions one by one. The Pershing didn't need to charge into the teeth of the enemy. It simply sat back and dismantled them. This sniper mentality of the American tankers was a far cry from the Hollywood image of wild charges. It was professional, cold, and incredibly efficient. The German POWs, many of whom were veterans of the brutal Eastern Front, admitted that they had never faced a more disciplined and well-equipped adversary.
As the last German pockets of resistance surrendered, the myth of the nightly Panzer was officially laid to rest. For years, the German tankers had seen themselves as modern knights, protected by the best armor in the world. But the Pershing had turned their plate mail into tinfoil. In the detention centers, the talk was no longer about victory or honor, but about the sheer, overwhelming power of the M26. One German tank ace, credited with over 50 kills, was seen sitting in the mud staring at a passing Pershing with a look of profound respect. He didn't see an enemy anymore. He saw the future. He told his fellow prisoners that the era of the King Tiger was over and the era of the main battle tank had begun. The Pershing had proved that a tank could be heavy, fast, and reliable all at once, a combination the Germans had thought impossible. This was the silent victory of the M26 Pershing. It wasn't just about the number of Tigers it destroyed, it was about the way it forced the German soldier to accept the truth. The shock of seeing the American tank wasn't just physical, it was philosophical. It destroyed the Nazi narrative that democracy was weak and that Aryan engineering was supreme. As the German POWs were eventually released and returned to their ruined homes, they carried with them the memory of the new American tank. It remained a symbol of the moment they realized the war was truly over. The Pershing had come late to the party, but it had brought the final word. And that word was written in 90mm steel, forged in the heart of America, and delivered with the unstoppable momentum of a superpower that had finally found its iron fist. As the fires of World War II began to cool, the M26 Pershing didn't go home. Instead, it stood as a silent sentinel on the border between the East and the West. German POWs, still being processed in camps near the Elbe, watched a new and chilling sight. American Pershings and Soviet IS-3 tanks staring each other down across a thin line of rubble. For the captured German officers, this was the ultimate irony. They had spent years trying to prove their superiority, only to be reduced to spectators in a new game played by two giants. They looked at the Pershing's 90mm gun and then at the Soviet 122mm cannon. One former Panther commander noted in his diary that the Pershing looked like a scalpel compared to the Soviet sledgehammer. He realized that the world had not become peaceful, it had simply found more dangerous masters.
The German prisoners began to offer their services as consultants to the Americans. They were desperate to tell everything they knew about Soviet armor, hoping to stay in the good graces of the men who owned the Pershings. But the American tankers just patted the thick armor of their Pershings and laughed. They had seen what their 90mm shells did to the invincible Tiger II, and they weren't afraid of the Stalin tanks. This confidence was infectious. Even the German POWs began to feel a strange sense of security in the presence of the M26. It was the only thing standing between them and the vengeance of the Red Army. The Pershing had transformed from a weapon of destruction into a shield for a broken Europe.
The shock that the German POWs felt when they first saw the M26 was just the beginning of a technological lineage that would define the next 50 years. The Pershing was the founding father of the Patton series, the tanks that would hold the line during the darkest days of the Cold War. German engineers, many of whom were eventually brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, studied the Pershing's blueprints with obsessive detail. They saw how the Americans had integrated the engine and transmission into a single power pack, a concept that revolutionized tank maintenance. They realized that the Pershing wasn't just a late-war fix, it was a blueprint for the future of all armored warfare. The German experts admitted that they had been chasing ghosts with their mouse prototypes, while the Americans had found the holy grail of tank design. In the POW camps, former German tank designers held secret seminars debating how they would have countered the Pershing if the war had lasted until 1946. They talked about E-series tanks and infrared sights, but their tone was hollow. They knew that no matter what they drew on paper, the American industrial machine could build it faster, better, and in greater numbers. The Pershing had proved that American quality was no longer an oxymoron. It was a terrifying reality. One captured engineer from the Henschel factory said, "We built the Tiger to be a god, but the Americans built the Pershing to be a soldier, and in the end, the soldier killed the god." This quote became a legend in the post-war intelligence community. It summarized the shift from the romanticized super tanks of the Reich to the practical, lethal efficiency of the American main battle tank. To truly understand the Pershing's power, we have to look at what happened just 5 years after the fall of Berlin. When the T-34-85s of North Korea crossed the 38th parallel, they seemed unstoppable. The early American light tanks were shredded, but then the Pershings arrived. The German veterans, following the news from their homes in a divided Germany, were not surprised by the result. The Pershing met the legendary T-34, the tank that had broken the back of the Wehrmacht, and it wasn't even close. The 90mm gun of the M26 could penetrate a T-34 from the front, the back, and even through the thickest part of the turret. In one engagement, a single Pershing destroyed several T-34s without taking a single hit in return. It was the Tiger versus Sherman story all over again, but this time the Americans were the ones with the invincible armor. The North Korean tankers, much like the German POWs before them, were speechless. They had been told that the T-34 was the best machine in the world, a machine that had humbled the Nazis. To see their shells bounce off the Pershing hull was a psychological trauma they couldn't recover from. The Pershing proved that it wasn't just a counter to German steel, but a superior design to the best the Soviet Union had to offer at the time. This confirmed what the German generals whispered in the POW camps in 1945. The Americans had reached the high ground of technology. The M26 was the king of the hill, and it would stay there until it evolved into the M46, M47, and eventually the M60. The Pershing shock was a global phenomenon that changed the way every nation on Earth thought about tanks. In the decades following the war, the memoirs of German tank aces were published, and a common thread emerged: the fear of the unknown American. Men like Otto Karius and Michael Whitman had he survived, would have had to reckon with the M26. In his later years, one surviving Panther commander wrote that his only regret was that he never got to command a Pershing. He described it as the tank that every German tanker secretly wanted. It had the power of a Tiger, the mobility of a Panther, and the reliability of a Volkswagen. To the men who had spent the war fighting in magnificent but broken machines, the Pershing was a dream. It represented a world where technology served the man, not the other way around. The German POWs who had been speechless in 1945 were finally finding their voices, and they were full of praise for their former enemy. Even the most hardcore Nazi officers had to admit in the privacy of their cells that the M26 was a masterpiece. It destroyed the final pillar of their ideology, the idea that a superior race would always produce superior tools. The Pershing was a product of a melting pot, designed by engineers with names from all over Europe, built by women and men in a free society, and manned by a citizen army. It was the democratic tank, and it had crushed the totalitarian tank. This was the ultimate victory of the M26 Pershing. It wasn't just a win on the battlefield, it was a win for a way of life. The silence of the German POWs as they looked at the Pershing was the silence of men witnessing the birth of a new world, a world where the American tank would stand as the ultimate guardian of freedom. Today, the M26 Pershing sits in museums, its olive drab paint faded, its 90mm guns silent. But the story of those German POWs and their speechless reaction remains one of the most important chapters of military history. It reminds us that technology isn't just about stats on a page, it's about the psychological impact on the human beings who have to face it. The Pershing was the moment the United States stopped being an industrial amateur in the eyes of the world and became the armored superpower. When you look at an M1 Abrams today, you were looking at the great-grandson of that first M26 that rolled into Elsdorf in 1945. The DNA of the Pershing is in every modern tank that protects the free world. It was the machine that ended the Tiger's reign and started the American century. As we finish this journey through the mud and smoke of 1945, remember the faces of those German soldiers. Remember their shock, their confusion, and their eventual realization that they were on the wrong side of history. The M26 Pershing didn't just win a war, it changed the future. It proved that innovation, backed by the will of a free people, can overcome any superweapon or Wunderwaffen. The next time you see a tank, think of the Zebra mission, the duel at Cologne, and the silent German prisoners who knew, the moment they saw the Pershing, that the world they knew was gone forever. The iron ghost of the Ardennes still haunts the dreams of those who think they can challenge the might of a prepared and determined democracy. This is the legend of the M26 Pershing, the tank that silenced the Reich. In the decades following the war, the memoirs of German tank aces were published, and a common thread emerged: the fear of the unknown American. Men like Otto Karius and Michael Whitman, had he survived, would have had to reckon with the M26. In his later years, one surviving Panther commander wrote that his only regret was that he never got to command a Pershing. He described it as the tank that every German tanker secretly wanted. It had the power of a Tiger, the mobility of a Panther, and the reliability of a Volkswagen. To the men who had spent the war fighting in magnificent but broken machines, the Pershing was a dream. It represented a world where technology served the man, not the other way around. The German POWs who had been speechless in 1945 were finally finding their voices, and they were full of praise for their former enemy. Even the most hardcore Nazi officers had to admit in the privacy of their cells that the M26 was a masterpiece. It destroyed the final pillar of their ideology, the idea that a superior race would always produce superior tools. The Pershing was a product of a melting pot, designed by engineers with names from all over Europe, built by women and men in a free society, and manned by a citizen army. It was the democratic tank, and it had crushed the totalitarian tank. This was the ultimate victory of the M26 Pershing. It wasn't just a win on the battlefield, it was a win for a way of life. The silence of the German POWs as they looked at the Pershing was the silence of men witnessing the birth of a new world, a world where the American tank would stand as the ultimate guardian of freedom. Today, the M26 Pershing sits in museums,
its olive drab paint faded, its 90-millimeter guns silent. But the story of those German POWs and their speechless reaction remains one of the most important chapters of military history. It reminds us that technology isn't just about stats on a page, it's about the psychological impact on the human beings who have to face it. The Pershing was the moment the United States stopped being an industrial amateur in the eyes of the world and became the armored superpower. When you look at an M1 Abrams today, you are looking at the great-grandson of that first M26 that rolled into Ellsdorf in 1945. The DNA of the Pershing is in every modern tank that protects the free world. It was the machine that ended the Tiger's reign and started the American century. As we finish this journey through the mud and smoke of 1945, remember the faces of those German soldiers. Remember their shock, their confusion, and their eventual realization that they were on the wrong side of history. The M26 Pershing didn't just win a war, it changed the future. It proved that innovation, backed by the will of a free people, can overcome any superweapon or Wunderwaffen. The next time you see a tank, think of the Zebra mission, the duel at Cologne, and the silent German prisoners who knew, the moment they saw the Pershing, that the world they knew was gone forever. The iron ghost of the Ardennes still haunts the dreams of those who think they can challenge the might of a prepared and determined democracy. This is the legend of the M26 Pershing, the tank that silenced the Reich.